On the evening of 6 March 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise left Zeebrugge, as if it were beginning another ordinary crossing. The harbor lights were still behind her. Passengers were still close enough to land that safety must have felt near. Crew members were moving through routines they had carried out many times before. On the bridge, nothing looked visibly wrong. But below them, at the front of the ship, the bow doors were still open. And the worst part is that this was not an unthinkable nightmare no one could have imagined. Warnings had already shown that something like this could happen. Within minutes, water would surge onto the vehicle deck, the ferry would lose stability, and hundreds of people inside would be thrown into darkness, cold water, and a ship that was no longer upright. 193 people would die. This is the story of a disaster often reduced to one terrible sentence. One door was left open. But the Herald of Free Enterprise did not capsize because of one simple mistake alone. It capsized because a company had already been shown the danger, and still allowed the conditions for that danger to survive. Tonight we're going inside the final departure of the Herald of Free Enterprise, the warnings that came before it, the moments in which the disaster might still have been stopped, and the trapped human chaos that followed when the ferry rolled onto its side just outside Zeebrugge harbor. The Herald of Free Enterprise was a roll-on, roll-off passenger ferry. That design made loading fast. Cars and freight could drive on and off through large doors at the bow and stern. It was efficient, familiar, routine. And that routine was part of the danger. Because on a ferry like this, the vehicle deck was a huge open space. If the ship went to sea with the bow doors open and water got onto that deck, the problem was no longer a small leak or a slow flooding event. It became a stability crisis. Water would not just enter, it would spread, and once it spread across that open deck, it could begin to destroy the ship's balance. That evening, none of that would matter if the bow doors were closed, but they were not. The official investigation later found that the Herald of Free Enterprise went to sea with both her outer and inner bow doors open. As speed increased, water entered the vehicle deck in large quantities and rapidly destroyed stability. The terrifying part is how invisible this danger was to the people who most needed certainty. From the bridge, the doors could not simply be seen and confirmed in the way many people imagine. To the people steering the ferry toward open water, the one detail that mattered most was not sitting in front of them like a glowing warning. It was somewhere below, unseen, unconfirmed, still open. One of the strongest facts in this story is also one of the most disturbing. The disaster had a precursor. Years before the Herald capsized, a similar failure had already exposed the danger. The formal investigation records that in October 1983, the assistant bosun on the Pride of Free Enterprise fell asleep, and the vessel sailed from Dover with both bow and stern doors open. That alone should have burned the risk into the company's mind, but there was more. In October 1984, a circular sent by the master of the Pride warned deck officers, bosuns, and assistant bosuns that the ship had already sailed on the Zeebrugge run with stern or bow doors open on more than one occasion. That means the disaster was not born in one isolated moment of bad luck. The pattern existed, the warning existed, the vulnerability existed. And still, when the Herald of Free Enterprise prepared to sail on 6 March 1987, the system was fragile enough for the same kind of failure to happen again. After the disaster, the formal investigation delivered one of the harshest judgments ever aimed at a company in a British maritime inquiry. It said the body corporate, from top to bottom, was infected with a disease of sloppiness. That phrase matters because it tells us this was not a neat, simple tragedy with one villain and one mistake. It was a culture. The report criticized management for failing to give proper attention to warnings and suggestions from shipmasters, including requests for bridge indicator lights to show whether bow and stern doors were open or closed. Think about how brutal that is. Captains and masters had already identified that this was a safety issue serious enough to deserve a simple, direct warning system. They wanted a way for the bridge to know. They wanted a system that did not depend entirely on memory, routine, or assumption. And the company still did not put that protection in place before the Herald sailed. The official report shows that even as late as October 1986, requests for bridge indication of door position were still being discussed, questioned, and treated as unnecessary by some within the company, rather than as an urgent safety requirement. One of the coldest parts of the inquiry is how small some of the missed margins were. The court found that the company later tried to argue the disaster could have been avoided if the chief officer had stayed on G deck another 3 minutes, and the report agreed that this was true. But then it added the more damning point: the company had taken no proper steps to ensure he remained there until the bow doors were closed. 3 minutes. That is the scale of one lost chance. 3 minutes between routine departure and catastrophe. The report also showed that deck officers felt intense pressure not to waste time. There was pressure to leave the berth promptly, and this culture of urgency mattered. So when people ask, how could a ferry leave port with its doors open? The answer is not only a man failed, it is also the system around him was built to keep moving. The company's standing orders were also part of the problem. After the disaster, the company removed what the inquiry called the negative reporting element and made it clear that ships should not leave until the master received a positive report that the bow or stern doors were closed. That tells you something chilling about the old system. Before the disaster, certainty did not have to arrive positively. Silence could survive where confirmation should have existed. And in safety-critical work, that is deadly. Because when no one has to say, clearly and positively, the doors are shut, an assumption can take the place of reality. And on 6 March 1987, reality was that the doors were still open. The Herald of Free Enterprise left Zeebrugge in the early evening. Passengers were settling in. Cars and freight were below. The ferry was still close enough to harbor that the outside world had not yet disappeared into open sea and darkness. But the ship had a hidden weakness, and another detail made it worse. Because of the Zeebrugge loading arrangement, the vessel sailed trimmed by the head. In simple terms, her bow sat lower than ideal for the danger she was carrying. The official investigation highlighted that ships on the Zeebrugge run could be required to arrive and sail trimmed by the head, and that this was one of the issues raised by masters. So now imagine the situation. The bow doors are open, the ship is accelerating, the bow sits low, the sea is ahead, water begins to come over the bowsprit and onto G deck. Once enough water gets onto the vehicle deck, it begins to move, and a moving mass of water on a vast open deck is not passive. It shifts, it runs, it destabilizes. This is why the disaster happened so fast. The Herald did not need to fill like a sinking box. It only needed enough water spread across that great deck to destroy stability. And then the ship rolled, rapidly, violently, with passengers still inside. This is the human center of the disaster. Because in a ship capsizing, confusion is not a side effect. It is part of the trap. People who had been walking down corridors suddenly found that the angle of the world was changing. Stairways stopped behaving like stairways. Doors became harder to reach. Loose objects moved. Furniture shifted. Passengers were thrown, knocked, trapped, and disoriented. And all of it happened close to shore. That detail makes the tragedy even harder to process, because distance usually helps us understand a maritime disaster. Far from land, far from help, deep sea, night, isolation. But the Herald of Free Enterprise capsized off Zeebrugge, close enough that the proximity of harbor lights made survival feel imaginable, even as escape was vanishing. That contradiction is what makes the story so haunting. They were not far away, but many still could not get out. Some survived by breaking or escaping through windows. The report contains an extraordinary detail here. It notes that the side windows were made of toughened glass, and evidence suggested that if they had instead been laminated safety glass or polycarbonate, the majority of people might have been lost, because escape through those windows would have been much more difficult. That is a detail many viewers will not know. Some people survived because the glass broke the way it did. In other words, survival in parts of the wreck depended not only on courage or luck, but on the behavior of a material in a moment of panic. That is the kind of strange, brutal fact that disaster history is full of, and it belongs in this story. When tragedies are retold, they often simplify people into neat roles. The hero, the victim, the man who caused it. But real disasters are rarely that tidy. Mark Stanley, the assistant bosun associated with the missed closure of the bow doors, is often remembered simply as the man who fell asleep and failed to carry out his duty. And that failure mattered. But the official report also records something else. After the Herald capsized, he found his way out onto the hull, broke a window to reach trapped passengers, cut his arm badly while clearing the glass, re-entered the hull, and went into the water to help passengers until cold and blood loss overcame him. That does not erase his failure, but it changes the emotional truth of the story. This disaster was bigger than one sleeping man. It was a chain of weak systems, flawed assumptions, company failures, urgency, routine, and missed safeguards. And once it began, even the people entangled in its cause could become rescuers inside its aftermath. The government later said that 350 people were rescued, while the casualty claimed 193 lives. The formal investigation itself recorded 188 confirmed fatalities in its findings, which is why both figures are associated with the disaster in official records. What matters for the human memory of the event is simple. Hundreds got out, hundreds did not, and the people trapped inside were enduring the final minutes of their lives in darkness, cold water, shattered orientation, and a ship lying on its side. Some disasters become symbols because they reveal a weakness that can no longer be ignored. The Herald of Free Enterprise was one of those disasters. Afterward, the pressure for change was immediate. The inquiry highlighted the need for door indicator systems, clearer bridge awareness, and more disciplined safety procedures. It also records that the company's standing orders were changed, so masters needed a positive report that doors were closed before leaving berth. The government summary also notes that one outcome of the accident was the formation of the Marine Accident Investigation Branch, the MAIB, in 1989. That means the Herald did not just expose a company's failures, it helped change how marine accidents would be investigated in Britain going forward. But no reform can undo the original fact. These changes came after the deaths. The warning systems, the scrutiny, the urgency of reform, all of it came after people had already drowned, been trapped, or died inside a capsized ferry that should never have reached open water with its doors unsecured. That is what makes this event feel so bitter. The solutions were not unknowable. Some of them had already been asked for. There are disasters that shock because they are violent. There are disasters that shock because they are mysterious. And then there are disasters like the Herald of Free Enterprise that stay with people because they feel horribly simple. One door, one deck, a few missed minutes, a company that had already been warned, a ship still close to harbor, people who should have been safe. That combination is what gives the story its weight. It is not only the death toll, it is the feeling that the catastrophe did not arrive out of nowhere. It was allowed to survive as a possibility. And when the final possibility became reality, it moved faster than the people inside could fully understand. That is why this story belongs on the dimming hour, because at its heart, this is a story about the moment survival became impossible, the moment routine turned into irreversible danger, the moment a ferry crossing became a death trap, and the moment all the ignored warnings finally became visible, too late to stop the sea from entering. It helped change how marine accidents would be investigated in Britain going forward, but no reform can undo the original fact. These changes came after the deaths. The warning systems, the scrutiny, the urgency of reform, all of it came after people had already drowned, been trapped, or died inside a capsized ferry that should never have reached open water with its doors unsecured. That is what makes this event feel so bitter. The solutions were not unknowable. Some of them had already been asked for. Tonight, we end where every disaster history channel should end, with the people. On 6 March 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise capsized off Zeebrugge. 193 people lost their lives. Behind every number was a passenger, a crew member, a family, a future, and a life interrupted in the space of minutes. Some died in the water. Some died trapped inside. Some never got the chance to understand what was happening before the world around them turned sideways. So before we leave this story, we pay respect to those who were lost in the Herald of Free Enterprise disaster, and to the survivors and families who carried it long after the ship itself was gone from the water. May they be remembered not only for the way they died, but for the fact that they were there at all.